A few days ago, noted climate change commentator Tony Heller released a new video with some killer facts that completely exposes the conspiracy over climate change. Or does it? Let's discuss. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. To be honest, I didn't really intend when I started doing these videos to start taking on the people that many label as climate deniers. By and large, the world community has moved on from simply debating the basics because the trends have become so clear. It's time really to focus on what's next. However, then I did a couple of debunking videos with people in the centre-right in the US because I really want to engage a discussion that gets climate back on the mainstream political agenda there. And then I did some debunking videos on extreme claims on the other side by Extinction Rebellion in the UK. And in the last week, several of my regular skeptic commentators dropped a link to this new video in the comments feed with a triumphant flourish. So there. So against my better judgment, I watched the thing and here we are. And basically, Tony Heller's definition of a climate alarmist seems to be anyone who believes climate change is happening and it's serious. The video alleges that it provides evidence of climate fraud. Fine, let's root it out, because nobody wants fraud going on. He starts by focusing on the National Climate Assessment for the US. Basically, it contained a bunch of graphs that seriously annoyed him. One of his arguments is that the data sequence for related graphs has been carefully selected to show the picture the dreadful alarmists want to show. Well, that's perfectly feasible. It's a well-known technique. In fact, Heller says it's a well-known technique used by the alarmists. However, as you'll know if you've seen the debate videos between him and Potholer54, linked below, it's a technique he's not always been averse to using himself. Anyway, let's hear the case for the prosecution from his latest video.
First, let's look at the Heatwave Graph, which starts in 1960. They carefully picked a period during the global cooling scare to start their graph so that they could show heat waves increasing over time. And here's the underlying data from the part of the National Climate Assessment which didn't go out to journalists and politicians. This graph is warm spells days, this one is heat wave magnitude, and this one is warmest temperature of the year. As you can see, summers were much hotter in the United States prior to 1960. So by hiding all the data before 1960, they were able to show a little bit of an upwards trend. I overlaid the part of the graph which went out to policymakers over here in this corner on top of the underlying data, and you can see exactly what they did.
So here we're talking about heat waves, and he's correctly pointing out that the graph going back to the 1900s shows a much bigger spike before the period of the graph used in the climate change document. And if you took that spike out, you'd say it was pretty much flat. Maybe a bit of a push upwards right at the end, but too short a period to make a trend. It's worth noting what that spike actually is. It is, of course, the great Dust Bowl of the 1930s. If you glance at the scientific literature about that period, we still don't conclusively understand all of the factors that led to the awful conditions that blighted so many lives. But it's believed to have been made more intense by the poor farming methods that were being used at the time, which displaced deep-rooted grasses that would trap moisture. And that would explain why it hasn't happened since, but we certainly don't know conclusively whether that was the case. In any case, it seems pretty clear that it's something of an extraordinary anomaly. But even if you don't have that, you still end up with a fairly flat picture which seems to support Heller's case. But this is just one of a number of related graphs, and this one uses a composite rating called a heat wave index, which is calculated, determined by what percentage of the country experienced how many heat waves. And like any composite figure, it's not always obvious exactly what story it's telling. A second related graph shows hot daily highs and hot daily lows, which means the days with the hottest day temperatures in the summer months plus the hottest nights in the same months. So here we still see the bump that is the 1930s Dust Bowl, but there's a much more pronounced trend from the 1980s onwards, where particularly the temperature of the daily lows are significantly increasing. So while the hot summer days have been increasing the last couple of decades, more notable is that there's less cooling off at night. If then we look at this graph, With extremes of cold in the winter, again we have a spike, this time a cold spike just before 1980. But since the 1980s, you can see clearly that extremes of cold are diminishing. The trend becomes even clearer with this graph, showing the averages for extreme hot temperatures and extreme cold temperatures shown on the same chart. The number of extreme hot days isn't that much higher, taken in isolation, from the highs of the 1950s, but whereas the highs and lows were very much in balance for that early period, it's much more skewed towards the highs in recent decades. So if the argument is that there are no warming trends in the last 3 decades, just uniform variability, well, the data doesn't seem to support that. And the selection of the time period for the graph really just looks like focusing on the period where the trend becomes evident. So let's move on.
This next graph is the one which shows wildfires increasing in the US since 1983.
Okay, this next one's about wildfires. I'm not that interested in this area, to be honest. There can be all sorts of reasons why fires break out, and unlike some, I've therefore never been one to cite wildfire data in support of anything. But, well, alright, since we're here, let's have a look.
And this graph of US forest fires from the US Forest Service is the one which didn't go out to journalists and politicians. And you can see why they hid all the data before 1983, because there was a lot more burn acreage in the United States prior to 1983.
Well, maybe. I look at that graph and my immediate thought is maybe there were much poorer forest management policies before the 1960s. But that's just speculation, so we keep digging. But look a bit more closely and you'll see that there is indeed an anomaly here. The first graph used in the National Climate Assessment is for US wildfires. The second graph, the one presented by Hella as his gotcha graph, is for total acreage burned, and that's not the same thing. Sure enough, I was finally able to locate someone that had tracked down sources for this, link provided below, and that early period had mostly been incendiary fires, fires which are deliberately started, not true wildfires. So it's not a like-for-like comparison. As I say, in any case, it's not the best indicator. As we get increasing extreme heat events, you would expect that authorities would gain experience in preventing or more rapidly dealing with a percentage of the wildfires, which is why I don't think it's a good primary indicator for climate change. Onwards.
Now let's look at the Arctic sea ice extent graph, which starts in 1979. Starting in 1979 makes it look like sea ice extent is decreasing linearly. And now let's look at the data which is being hidden. This graph is from the 1990 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. It shows Arctic sea ice extent all the way back to the early 1970s. And as you can see, extent was much lower prior to 1979. In 1979 was the peak. The data was taken from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Ooh, hidden data on Arctic sea ice sounds very nefarious. The first question I had was this: why does Hella use a graph from the 1990 IPCC report? I mean, that's 20-year-old data. Well, let's park that question for a moment. The first and obvious reason why the graphs all start in 1979 is because that's when the satellite measurements came on track. Before then, what information we have about Arctic sea ice extent came from other observations very much differently based. Indeed, I tried to identify the original data source for the graph that was given, but the official data sites now simply don't offer data before 1979. I did find a blog that said the NOAA had said that they weren't able to locate the source of the graph. Maybe that period before the satellite measurement was just so completely incomparable that they didn't want to produce a composite. But wait, Hella has doubt to cast on that satellite measurement only coming about in 1979 point.
And here's the accompanying text from the 1990 IPCC report. Satellite observations have been used to map sea ice extent routinely since the early 1970s. The American Navy Joint Ice Center has produced weekly charts which have been digitized by NOAA. So they hid the data before 1979 and tried to use the excuse that we didn't have satellite data prior to 1979.
So I did some more digging around because something certainly looks odd. In 1979, satellite measurement using passive microwave data began. Before then, from 1953, information was available from a number of other sources, including satellite imaging, in other words, photographs of the Arctic taken from space, where you could try to tell what was ice and what wasn't. So yes, satellite measurement of a type, but of a very different and less reliable sort. However, I did finally track down a properly integrated graph of the pre and post 1979 data where the best assessments we were able to make before satellite imaging was added to the data that came afterwards. And it looked like this. As you can see, looking from the perspective of 1990, which is the finishing point for the graph Heller uses, you can say there was still a slight dip in the mid-1970s, not as large as the one he showed, but still definitely there. But now let's add the data for what's happened since that first IPCC report. Well, I don't know. You tell me. Tony, do you see a trend there? I'm pretty sure I see a trend. It's probably just a trick of the light.
Here's one more graphic showing U.S. sea level rising over the past century. As if sea level around the U.S. could somehow be different than it is in the rest of the world.
Well, actually, Tony, yes, it can be. As the National Ocean Service says, most people are surprised to learn that just as the surface of the Earth is not flat, the surface of the ocean is not flat, and that the surface of the sea changes at different rates around the globe. If you're trying to represent the science in this area, seems like a pretty elementary error. Heller selects specifically New York to report the sea level rises, but in so doing, he must have become aware of this, clearly showing the variation in sea level rise in different parts of the US, some significantly above the one chosen from New York. Let's go back to the global sea level trends, since those are actually the key ones. And as related in the most recent IPCC report on the oceans, the trend is slightly increasing, now up to 3.3 millimetres per year. There are reasons why we expect this to increase further, relating to the observable and measured melting of Antarctic land ice, which I covered in my video commentary on Bjorn Lomborg. We'll move on at this point though, because you get the idea. That's really most of the data points. There are a few other things thrown in to aim to convince you that this is all a big conspiracy. One, for instance, is this quote by Dr. Ottmar Endenhofer, who is alleged to have spilled the beans about how this is all a secret plot to redistribute wealth under the disguise of environmental policy. However, this is a well-known misquote you'll find all over the climate conspiracy websites. It actually comes from this interview here, which is in German. If you type the full text into the 2019 version of Google Translate, which may be better than it was when Heller and others did this originally, you see that there's nothing resembling that quote very closely at all. He's talking, and note the date, nearly a decade ago, about the challenges for developing countries vis-à-vis the politics of reducing emissions when you're trying to get out of poverty. You can see how that commentary on that theme could have ended up garbled into what Heller says, but it was clearly not the intent. Heller then goes on to ridicule some of the campaigners who say we only have 12 years left before the end of the world, and on that we finally have something we can agree. But the best cases should be supported with the best arguments and the best data, which clearly is not what we find in this video. Alright, I doubt I'll go again into the full-on addressing the deniers because life is too short and the signs of our situation are showing themselves plainly, and we really do need to move the debate on that is still to be had. What are the smart ways to respond to our current situation that brings with them the best chance of achieving the best available outcome? That's an area where there's a lot of ground to cover. All of it much more interesting and consequential than poring over 20-year-old datasets and trying to identify some odd quirk that you can attribute to some conspiracy or cover-up.